Thanks for coming on. So overnight, Labour has announced you're going to vote against one of Rishi Sunak's main moves in last week's budget, which is freezing income tax thresholds for 5 years. Labour shadow cabinet ministers said the party backed freezing the income tax threshold on the day and just after. I do remember shadow Work and Pension Secretary Jonathan Reynolds said that on this very station. So you've had a change of mind.
Well, the difficulty is that what has emerged in the budget is that not only is this coming in at the same time as council tax hikes, it's looking likely that people will face a council tax rise of about 5% because of the cuts to councils, plus universal credit being cut by £20 in 6 months' time, and a key worker pay freeze. So families are facing this perfect storm of a squeeze on their finances. Not only that, but on top of that, it's now become apparent that businesses are not going to be asked to pay for additional taxes for a full year after the government is proposing to target low and middle income families. We just think that is the wrong approach. That is exactly the way that you choke off a recovery before it's begun. We've got to get money into the pockets of low paid workers so that they can go out and spend it on their high streets. And that's why we'll be voting against these measures this week.
Okay, just to be clear, I think the release says that Labour doesn't think it's fair that workers and families should be asked to repair the economic damage of the pandemic before big business. Is your position that workers and families should not have to contribute anything towards the nation's vast COVID debts, or they should contribute something, just big business needs to go first?
I think everybody in this country, including the Labour Party, accept that we've got to pull together and all contribute in order to get through this recovery. But we can't keep making the same mistakes as we've made in the past. In 2010, we had these huge, deep cuts to the public sector, money taken out of the pockets of low and middle income families. And the consequences of that you can see on the high streets. People couldn't spend, businesses were struggling, couldn't hold on to staff. So the absolute priority has got to be to make sure that we can keep people in work, we can keep businesses going, and that we enable families to come through this. And that, in the end, is the best way that you keep people paying taxes, that you don't increase the size of the debt that needs to be paid off. Almost every major economist in this country agrees with us, and it's one of the reasons we were relieved that Rishi Sunak, after all the briefings about raising corporation taxes immediately and some of the briefings about very high tax rises, we were relieved that some of that seems to have been abandoned last week.
Okay, you don't want income tax thresholds to be frozen at all, I think is what you're saying. You'll also know, because you're an economist of some training, that freezing the thresholds raises £19 billion over the next 5 years for the government to repair the huge deficit that's currently running at roughly £240 billion. If you're not going to make those savings, where would you raise that £19 billion from instead?
Well, we want a fair plan, and we're willing to work with the government to get a fair plan in order to make sure that we can repay the amount that has been borrowed during this pandemic.
What does a fair plan mean?
But a fair plan means a plan that doesn't rest once again, on the shoulders of working people who didn't play any part in causing this crisis. And not only that, but have actually gone out day after day during the pandemic, often for very low wages, and kept the country moving at high risk, not just to themselves, but to their families as well. So we've got to have a fair approach to this that says that those with the broadest shoulders bear the greatest burden. And there is time to put that together, given that interest rates are currently very low. And I think there is a broad economic consensus that would be the right thing to do. But right now, the focus absolutely has to be on supporting businesses so that they survive, supporting people to remain in work, and making sure that families can get through this crisis.
Okay, but just to be clear, if you want to be a responsible opposition, which you say you are, if you want to be a shadow government in waiting, you do have to say what else you'd do if you don't want the government to raise £19 billion there. You talk about those with the broadest shoulders paying more. Well, are you talking about, for example, a return to the 50p rate of tax for the most well off? Would you like that to raise your 19 billion instead?
Well, look, we'd look at that closer to the time. There is, at the moment,
The time is now. The deficit is now.
sorry, Tom, but I don't accept that. I think that the time right now is a time for helping the country to pull through what is still a crisis. We're still in lockdown. Businesses are still shuttered on high streets across the country. Many of them in communities like mine in Wigan haven't had anybody coming through the doors for the best part of a year because we've been in almost permanent lockdown in parts of the north of England. We've got to make sure that those businesses can get through this. That's why we said we didn't support immediate tax rises on businesses. And we've got to make sure that people can stay and work, because the tragedy of mass unemployment is something that in communities like mine in Wigan is very, very present in people's minds. We've lived with this before, and we're still living with the consequences of those very high rates of unemployment 20, 30 years later. So it's got to be the immediate priority. We're in step with most major economists on that. We're in step with most of our allies around the world, whether it's the United States or countries across Europe. We need stimulus at the moment in order to make sure that we get people through this.
Okay, let me ask you about the wider picture after the budget. Were you disappointed to see the Conservatives increase their poll lead up to 13 points after this budget, where taxes, after all, did go soaring?
Well, look, we want a Labour government. We believe that that is the only future for this country to come out of the pandemic and start to rebuild and strengthen the foundations of society and the economy that have been weakened in recent years. But what I'm not sorry about, and will make no apology about, is that we, like the rest of the country, want the government to succeed in defeating coronavirus. We want the country to come through this. And Keir Starmer became leader in the middle of a global pandemic. I don't think that's ever happened before, certainly not in my lifetime. And we make no apology for parking the kind of Yarboo sucks politics that Boris Johnson is so fond of. We will support the government where they're getting it right. And when they get it wrong, whether it's over the borders, whether it's over being slow to call for a circuit break, whether it's over the way that they responded to Dominic Cummings breaking the rules, we will call them out for that. We absolutely will. And we make no apology for that either. But we'll also offer constructive solutions to try and help the country through that.
I mean, you do hear this quite a lot from Labour politicians such as yourself, that we're not in normal times, and and of course we're not. So politics is not normal either. And you hear often this 1945 analogy as well, that Churchill might have won the war, but after the war people wanted something different, and you don't think the Tories are offering that. The problem with the 1945 analogy is, of course, that Attlee government was incredibly bold, incredibly reformist, and people aren't hearing any reforms or boldness from you. I can't think of a single big new policy you've announced. So is it maybe not just we're in wartime polling, etc., but actually people just simply haven't heard anything from you that they wanted to vote for? When are you going to give them that bold new vision, which might be only 2 years away from a general election?
Well, look, I think most people in this country at the moment are just thinking about their families' futures. They're thinking about children returning to school. They're wondering whether young people are going to get fair qualifications this summer. They're worried about the fact that we've still got reasonably high infection rates in many parts of the country, still got people dying from COVID. The vaccine hasn't been rolled out to most of the population yet, although it's been a stunning effort to do so in tribute to everybody involved. I think that's what most people are thinking about. Last week, Keir Starmer started to set out some of the principles behind the recovery, about the fact that we've gone into this pandemic with 4 million children in poverty, with many families without the savings and the resilience that they needed to withstand the shock and a crisis to their own family finances, and our public services underfunded and overworked, and so very little capacity and resilience there either, and how he wants to see that to change. And you will see more of that from us in the coming months. But I really won't apologise for the fact that we have been so relentlessly focused on trying to make sure that the government gets these day-to-day decisions right over things like closing the borders, which, we've seen the same mistakes made over and over again. And we have spent a great deal of time and energy trying to persuade them to fix those problems, fix test, trace and isolate, fix the exam system so we don't have a repeat of last summer. And
Okay.
it just seems to me that is exactly the right thing that a responsible opposition will be doing at the moment.
Fine, let me ask you this. I did put something similar to Gavin Williamson as well. Do you have some sympathy for Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex, in the way that certainly she's told Oprah Winfrey that she was treated by the royal family?
Um, I have a lot of sympathy for Meghan and any woman in the public eye. I think, before she became the Duchess of Sussex, she was doing a great deal of work for the United Nations as an ambassador about women's leadership roles and empowerment, which I've always admired. And to go from that to having to deal with some sections of the media, and I say this, present company accepted, but some sections
Excluded
of the
or
media
accepted?
Accepted, excluded, accepted, not counted in
Go on,
the
sorry.
attacks on Meghan, as far as I'm aware. But
Go on.
I think it must have been a very difficult thing actually to make that transition into suddenly finding that what she wears, what she eats, whether she opens a car door herself or not, is the subject of huge criticism. I think that must be a very difficult thing. And actually, there's a broader point here about how women are treated in the media. There was a King's College study a few years ago that found that 80% of quotes from experts in the British media came from men. Women were far more likely to be quoted as victims rather than as experts. Some of it is not so subtle, some of it is subtle, but I think that there is a problem for women in the public eye, and I think that's something actually that, this is a horrible situation for the royal family. I wouldn't wish it on any family going through it, but if something positive can come out of this, perhaps we could have a debate about the way in which women are presented, and see if we can do this better in this country.
Okay, Lisa Nandy, Shadow Foreign Secretary, thank you very much for coming on G&T.
Oh, thank you.